Date windows on watches. Some can't live with them, others can't live without them. And a great email came in from Blaine, who asks me about my thoughts on the design and the execution of the date window or the date display. He would argue that many watch dials compromise when it comes to including a date display, but it is something that most collectors just accept. In particular, he's talking about the location and the relativity of the size of the display. He wants to know my opinion on who gets it right and who doesn't get it quite right. So, the question, what makes a good date window on a watch? One that is easy to read, one that is unobtrusive, one that is subtle, all of these things. The truth is, with any element on a watch dial, what makes anything good is when it has been well considered. And in the case of placing dates on a watch face, there is a fine line. They have the potential of making or breaking a presentation, throwing off the balance. But if it is done well, they can go unnoticed unless looked for. Or in some very special cases, they are there to accentuate the dial. And realistically, most of us have the ability of being able to determine what makes a good date window. This is most definitely a subjective area, but I think some ground rules that make a good first impression: matching the color of the date window with the dial. In some cases, it's not necessary, but it's a good rule of thumb. Preferably, in most cases, you also want it to be balanced on the dial. Let's begin then with the universal date placement, which is at the 3 o'clock position. Surprisingly, why this placement became the definitive answer, difficult to know, difficult to understand. But what it does do, one of the big positives around this placement, is that it is easy to identify. We can find that in most situations, you can recognize that the watch has a date when we see it at the 3 o'clock position. And that could be something that appeals to the owner. But if we're talking about the more design-oriented exercise, being offset in an asymmetrical position does also break up the dial in such a way that you can easily glance at the time and the date relatively simply. I believe that this is the strongest positive that this position allows. Not only is it easily identifiable, but it also allows for the watch to be broken up into segments. We notice that with some pieces, it also makes for a very nice display, especially when Arabics are involved. The 6, 9, and 12 are counterbalanced very nicely with a date at the 3 o'clock. But then unfortunately, the con behind this location is that it can also look very lazy. It can be addressed very lazily by manufacturers. It is now the, we could say, staple position that we see with most watches. And when it is not addressed with, let's say, a framing around it, it can also look very awkward, as if it was an afterthought. This location especially, I believe, has the potential of making or breaking the presentation of a watch dial. It may be the most common, it may be the most easiest to recognize, but it can also look very cheap if done the wrong way. We move to the date placement between the 4 and the 5. Many call it the 4:30 position. And this one doesn't get the credit that I believe it deserves. In lots of cases, if done right, it can appear as if the watch doesn't have a date. And this is a very nice aspect. We see that this configuration is often adopted by chronographs for obvious reasons, allowing it to be placed out of the way so the subdials have full allocation and space on the dial. Honestly, I do believe it to be one of the best integrations of a date window because there are barely any drawbacks. The biggest positive is that it's out of the way. The biggest negative, I would say, is that for some who are really pedantic, it does break up the dial slightly, but it also doesn't compromise any of the most important features on the dial or the watch face. The one downside would be that you have to crane your neck to look at the date at an angle. Other than that, it's a great feature that rides unnoticed, and I believe that many more watches should use this feature. We now move to the date window at the 6 o'clock position, one that has been adopted more and more in recent years. It gives a sense of modernity to the watch face and does, in many ways, feel a lot more considered when you look at the overall presentation of the watch. There are positives and negatives to this. Of course, it looks the most balanced. Subconsciously for the wearer, it feels as if a lot more thought was put into this small complication, that there was a sense of care for how it was integrated into the dial. The downside, though, is that in some situations it can look too symmetrical. No longer does it break up the dial, allow for easy time telling. Your eye can sometimes get lost in the details. As much as our eyes love the idea of symmetry and balance, sometimes it can be too much. And when it comes to telling the time on the fly or reading the date, Visually, when you're looking at the watch face, your eyes might struggle when focusing on the individual components. I do believe that's similar to the 4:30 position. When this is done correctly, it can be masterfully executed, especially when there is a small plot included at the 6 o'clock position, so it feels even more integrated. There are some amazing examples of watches with this configuration that you would swear do not have date complications unless they are pointed out to you. So the pros and cons surrounding this integration is fairly equal. One side, we could say that it feels as if a lot more care was put into this format. The downside is that it can also disappear into the dial, not breaking up the details, instead in some situations blending into the background, and in others making the watch look too symmetrical. Next to one of the oldest configurations, the pointer date. This format is something we would expect to see from much older pieces, but it is also receiving quite the revival today, and it is worth discussing and investigating. I believe it to be a brilliant use of the complication. It feels a lot more organic as a presentation, especially when we see that the hour, the minute, the seconds hand all have this relationship. Why not have a fourth hand to add an extra feature? Doesn't it feel more correct when you look at a date on a watch this way? The beauty is that it gives you a lot more dynamism on the dial, a lot more character, especially when every day the hand will move to another position. It doesn't feel awkward, it doesn't feel jarring. In many situations, we feel that there is a direct purpose to how this was done. Even if you are someone who doesn't know much about watches, this simple format to reading the date is a very easy system to pick up on. The best time when the pointer date can be used is when the dial is sparse, when it is lacking a lot of detail. I think some of the best dress watches in the world deserve this configuration especially. It feels a lot more mechanical, it feels more realistic, it doesn't feel hidden. That being one of the downsides of the date window, you can't see the complication working behind the scenes. This way, there is a sense of tactility behind the reading and the presentation. The downside is, we could say, it does look a bit obstructive in some situations. In many cases, we notice that the actual pointer is actually in red, which does attract a lot of attention to where it's pointing. And I'm sure that can be irritating for some. But on the whole, another brilliant use of a date complication. One that speaks in the purest way about how a mechanical watch should be presented. This next method is one of the newest we have seen with a lot of recent releases. More of a modern approach, and that is what I call the skeleton date. Of course, we see this configuration the most with skeletonized dials, when the dials themselves represent the movement of the watch. We see them in the more highly complicated pieces, the watches that can look very cluttered on first impressions. What the skeleton date allows, what I've just mentioned about how the date window being hidden doesn't let you enjoy the mechanics. This format lets you see everything. And the real beauty is that you're seeing this almost as a stencil. Instead of it being a disc that is painted and filled, this is a disc that has been hollowed out in such a way that you can enjoy how it is being projected onto a backdrop. For the watch lover, this further emphasizes our appreciation of the mechanical nature behind the complication. In most situations, it is done so well that it is virtually hidden unless you go looking for it. But then its one downside is that it can be quite illegible and difficult to see at a glance. This configuration especially needs to work with the correct watch. It doesn't work with every piece. It needs to have certain characteristics, like a skeletonized dial, for it to really make sense. But what it does lack with legibility, it makes up for with mechanical competence. The large or the oversized date is one that almost epitomizes the competency of watchmaking. We see this configuration used with most watches that we would consider to be of high horology status. It's very difficult to have this feature included into a watch. Most of the time, with some of the best examples, they have two separate windows that rotate individually. And as we move further up the tiers, we start seeing things like asymmetry adopted. These dates are not made to be hidden. As said in the beginning, these rare exceptions are there to be used as features. They are there to represent the effectiveness of a watch dial and very much become a talking point in themselves. When we get to this level, we move away from the watch simply having a complication for the sake of it. This is almost a perfect in-between, where we get to admire the complication and the mechanics behind it, as well as just where it is placed and how it works as a part of this symbiotic relationship that it shares with many of the other aspects of the dial. Very much like the mechanical competency that we see with skeletonized windows, this also celebrates the art of watchmaking, giving us this classical feel but also a sense of modernity, showing us how far watchmaking is pushing the idea forward. And another thing to add is that being a large date window, you don't need features, we could say, added on features like Cyclops lenses to make it any bigger. There is no need for magnification, and therefore it feels a lot more purposeful. As a complication, it truly embodies its purpose. Then following on with this idea of mechanical competency, looking back to past inspirations and finding a good meeting point, the date window as a subdial does adopt many of these things. It shares the same age as the pointer date. It is a very traditional approach. We do find that very often it is centered at the base of the dial. So not only do you get to see a full picture of the dial, all the numerals or batons nicely arranged, but it also lets you center your eye when it comes to reading the subdial. And in many ways, this feature, to me at least, feels a lot more like a complication. It's not hiding any of the most important features. It is there on display, and it also looks very purposeful. A lot more thought needs to go into this format, especially when it comes to the choice of hand, the choice of typeface, the thickness of the line weight, how it would bring balance or, in some cases, overthrow the visual weight on the dial. This configuration is also used predominantly by some of the best watchmakers, similar to the large date. It's a method that feels way more traditional, but also does allow for more opportunity, especially when you're using a watch that has a full perpetual calendar integration. 3 sets of subdials indicating features like the day, the date, and the month makes a lot more sense when they are arranged in this fashion. You've seen that in many of these examples, some configurations work better than others, and it really is, at the end of the day, all down to the watch. How well does this complication fit the watch? Unfortunately, as Blaine mentioned, and I do agree, date complications are just thrown onto the dial. They aren't thought about, they aren't considered. And we do find today that in many situations, especially with a lot more of the most expensive pieces out there, the date windows just don't feel correct. They don't feel like any care was put into them. Just the simple idea of matching the window with the dial makes such a difference. I also have this firm belief, especially when we're referring back to design, is that it should be there when it is necessary, when it is required, but in the background when it isn't. On a watch, it can be very difficult to get that across, especially when the date is a part of the upholstery. Fortunately for us today, there are so many options and new configurations that we can find, and it means that creatively the possibilities are endless. But I leave you with a take-home parting message. When you are next looking at a watch, considering one to own, think critically about the date complication. Where it is placed. Does it actually complement the dial architecture? Could it be put somewhere else to make a difference? Does it feel like it was actually considered or just put there for the sake of it? For me at least, it is down to the watch. I don't necessarily judge the watch by its complications, but rather how appealing it feels to the eye, how its aesthetics work, and how this relationship has matured. If given the choice to conceptualize the best date window on a watch, I would want it in a place like the 6 o'clock position, where it doesn't get in the way of the features, integrates into the Arabic numerals, into the subdial. Essentially, and I'll say it again, one that I don't want to see unless I am looking for it. I would like to know what method best works for you and where you would like to see improvement. So if we are to think about the title a bit more, the best and the worst date complications on watches, it's extremely difficult to clarify. All of these have positives and negatives surrounding them, and the greatest negative is that if it's done wrong, they just look cheap. They don't look professionally done, and they can, in some situations, just ruin the wearing experience. Referring back to that original statement, some can't live with them and others can't live without them. Just like with so many other things in this hobby, it rings true.